And thank you for coming out on a rainy day in Washington, D.C. We're really grateful for that. So for those who don't know me, my name is Sally Yozel. I'm the director of the Environmental Security Program here at the Stimson Center. And the Stimson Center is a research institution, and for those online, welcome. And the Stimson Center is based in Washington, D.C. And we work on a range of national security issues, including how climate change affects everything from U.S. foreign policy and UN peacekeeping to the economic security of communities in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific. So we are so excited about kicking off today's event. It's the inaugural Climate Talk series, which is hosted by the German Embassy here in Washington, D.C., in partnership with the Stimson Center. And we're so grateful to the Embassy for really, sponsoring these Climate Talk series. So what it means is over the next several months, the series will include really in-depth discussions covering a range of climate issues, climate security topics, from climate change and peacekeeping and finance and gender and issues related to the Global South. So to open today's series, it's really my honor to introduce His Excellency Andreas Michaelis, the new ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany here in Washington and to the United States. And Ambassador Michaelis arrived in Washington just last month, I believe, and really brings a depth of experience. Prior to his current position, he was the state secretary when Germany published its first national security strategy, which had identified really climate change as a threat to the country's own national security. And Germany has been a leader on this for a long time. When we stepped out a few years back, they really stepped up, and they've really had strong support of climate mitigation and adaptation, which we'll talk a lot about today. And this can be seen most recently through the Rising Nations Initiative, the UN Group of Friends on Climate and Security, and the Global Shield Against Climate Risks, which I hope we will hear a bit more about today. And I also, have to say that I applaud the leadership of their State Secretary, Jennifer Morgan, who really travels the world also endlessly on this issue. And then earlier this month, Germany announced 450 million euros in climate finance pledges at the inaugural African Climate Summit in Nairobi. So, Mr. Ambassador, I'm going to turn it over to you because you are who people have come to hear, and we are so grateful again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I would like to welcome Ambassador Falefu among us today. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to open this event, this series of climate talks that the German Embassy in Washington is organizing together with the Stimson Center for the first time this year, knowing full well that there is an outstanding array of climate events in Washington from numerous think tanks and institutions. We hope the series will contribute to the climate discussion here in Washington and provide a forum for participants from different backgrounds. As you know, Germany places a particular focus on climate issues in its foreign policy. You mentioned I worked as the State Secretary of the German Foreign Office before coming here to Washington, and I was actually hired for that job for the second time by the minister that is in charge of the ministry now, Annalena Baerbock, and the minister is a minister of the Green Party, which is one party in the three-party coalition that runs the German government. And because she entered the ministry and had this idea from the first day that we should focus more on climate issues, not just climate, but environmental issues and questions of energy transition, It was also part of my job, together with Jennifer Morgan, to actually restructure the Home Ministry. So what we have seen now is not only that we, kind of put a bit of paint on a flag and started to wave it and said, we do climate policy. No, what we actually did was we cut deep into the structure of the German Foreign Office and set up a new deputy Directorate General with a very sizable number of collaborators to be able to reflect climate policy in our foreign policy approach. So a concept followed soon. And we are now in a phase where we empower embassies to engage in relevant climate activities. So that has a project side, because we fully understand you can't have a policy without having some money to underpin it. And in this case, we also make relevant funds available, something that makes a difference when it comes to countries who are not in a position to adopt the policies they would like to adopt to move forward when it comes to climate security. But this, you will imagine, in terms of the culture of the ministry, in terms of the working structure, because Jennifer Morgan suddenly became the third state secretary in the ministry. We had, for 50 years, we had just 2 state secretaries. So we were willing, and we are in a phase of real cultural change here. So we do this not just because we believe and think it is politically expedient, but I think you can say we firmly believe then there can be no foreign policy today without a focus on climate issues. I recently adopted with my colleagues a completely new country concept that deals with Brazil. It will not surprise you, we basically wanted to take the initiative once there was a new opening given the presidential elections in Brazil and Lula taking over. That is a good example that can demonstrate that suddenly you're moving forward with a very developed and very round concept of how you combine your political approach to a country with relevant climate-related objectives. We have all seen it from devastating wildfires to deadly storms and floods. Each and every continent has experienced extreme weather events of an unprecedented scale and extent. Therefore, we put climate diplomacy at the core of our work. This year, the German government produced and it was mentioned, a national security strategy for the first time. In it, the concept of security is defined more broadly than in the traditional sense. And as I headed our interagency drafting effort when it came to this strategy, took us almost a whole year to finalize our work because what we really put at the very center of that work was a concept of integrated security. So we touched on many aspects of resilience because we realized this is not just a question of defense in the traditional sense and relevant security agencies which guarantee our security, but that was very much also a question of what do we do at home in order to preserve our climate, for instance, and that's why climate crisis and also relevant changes of our ecosystem are very much considered as a security threat. So that gives a new dimension and makes it also, I think we can be very frank here, it makes it also easier if you consider climate a pressing issue and you can couch it in terms of security concerns in a national strategy. It makes it much easier to mobilize to mobilize the necessary support and the necessary resources, and looking especially at small island states in the Pacific. You know, if I compare there, it really is an existential issue, and I can fully understand that when it comes to the security side of climate policy, that is particularly important. So, the German government has understood that we have to do something about climate change in order to preserve our prosperity and our well-being. So security, therefore, also means sustainability. This is true for us, and we believe this is also true for the people of the United States of America. But people in Germany and here in the US see and feel the consequences of climate change, be it extreme weather events, heat waves, droughts. Nevertheless, the current level of threat for us is not the same as it is for people in other parts of the world. We in Europe and in the US live in rich countries with strong economies, and that's very different when it comes to the impact of climate change in countries that do not enjoy a comparable prosperity. And that's why I think we are, as a government, very happy that the US invited representatives, leaders from small Pacific Island states here to Washington, where we could learn about the meeting yesterday from the media. Sounds very, very positive. I very much hope that the resources that were identified on that occasion will also come forward. We have just opened, and we haven't done it for, I think, almost 20 years. We haven't opened an embassy. We basically work with the system we have. But we just opened an embassy in Suva in June of this year, because we feel that's where we need to be if we really want to pursue a serious policy and strategy when it comes to ecology and climate. That's where we are, and it cannot be done just from Canberra and Wellington. And in that spirit, because I'm a big fan of rugby and I follow the Rugby World Cup, you know, it's amazing what Fiji has achieved in that tournament so far, and I very much hope that they're moving forward to the quarterfinals, and they leave Australia, on this occasion, they leave Australia behind, and they have a very, very good tournament. All the best, Ambassador, to you and other partners in the Pacific, and I wish you a very successful and very good conference and meeting here today. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, now that I get rearranged over here. And thank you for those very thoughtful comments. You know, talking about the integrated security approach is just so important, and I commend you for pulling all of that together. And honestly, a year doesn't sound that long to me, so I doubly commend you. You know, there's just no doubt, as we all just heard, that Germany is a global leader and an excellent partner, not only with the U.S., but island states and developing countries all around the world, but very decisive in your leadership and the actions you take. And we just really appreciate all the work that you're doing. And of course, you know, we appreciate this climate talk series that we're doing together over the next several months. And again, just to remind you that it'll be a wide range of discussions on climate challenges and solutions, from peacekeeping to gender and international financial system and the issues facing island states in the global south. So what I'd like to do now is welcome our panelists, and I'll introduce you, and I'd appreciate if you come up in the order. First, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We have His Excellency Tapugao Falevo, the permanent representative of Tuvalu to the United Nations. Ambassador Falafu was appointed last February, and prior to that served in leadership positions across the government of Tuvalu. And he's already warned us a little bit. He was at a late night dinner at the State Department, and so with the Pacific Island Forum, but I know he's going to be terrific. Next we have Christina Chan, who is the Senior Adaptation Advisor to the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry. Christina has deep experience working on climate adaptation and disaster preparedness, including both at the State Department and with the World Resources Institute. So thank you, Christina. Our other speaker is Alice Hill, who is the David Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. Alice has been a longtime leader on climate issues, including serving as the Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council and the lead for the Department of Homeland Security's first ever climate adaptation plan for the United States, as well as the author of several very important books in this area. So if I could just set the stage briefly before we go into questions for our panel. You know, last night was a State Department dinner for the U.S. Pacific Island Forum, and your Prime Minister, Netanyahu, said that island states are facing a climate war, and the planet is in defeat. And, you know, at the past several climate COPs, island states and developing countries have really continued to sound that alarm, urging donor countries to do more to build climate adaptation and resilience and safeguard economic and human security. This is particularly true in coastal communities, whether it's Kiribati, you know, one of your sister island states that worries about literally disappearing due to sea level rise, or we can even look around another part of the world where we saw recently the flooding in Libya, which has killed upwards of 11,000 people. And scientists just came out a few days ago to say again that 2023 will be the Earth's warmest on record, including breaking ocean temperatures, which have really caused massive coral reef die-off. And the Caribbean islands, Australia, the Pacific Islands, you know, really depend on their corals for their tourism, for their blue economy. You know, it's amazing to me, but 350 million visitors go to see corals all around the world. And that's a value of like $36 billion. Really important revenues for the blue economies of these countries. And then in addition to that, the warming waters are also just upending global fisheries that are so essential to food security all around the world. More than 3 billion people depend on fish for their major source of protein. And the industry globally is $406 billion for fish-related revenues. Again, really important to the blue economies. So whether it's economic security or food security, ecological security, or human security, they are all at risk due to climate change. And our team here at Stimson, we have a program called the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Index. You know, we just came back from Madagascar, where we're doing a Corby project. And when you think about Madagascar, it has been hit by 8 cyclones in the last 13 months. And, you know, this is a country which has emitted very little of the greenhouse gases, but is one of the most vulnerable. And just to give you a brief snapshot of some of the things we saw. I mean, we were in the city of Tomasina on the East Coast, which is responsible for 90% of Madagascar's imports and exports. And they see these frequent storms, which is causing major flooding and literally washing away housing and businesses on a regular basis, leaving countless of people homeless and businesses shuttered. Flooding causes industrial and human waste to just pour into canals and riverways where people recreate, where they bathe, where they get their drinking water. And the floods are also closing the main roads to the rest of the country and the main rail service, which literally, when this transportation halts, it halts the major economy of that country. It just grounds to a halt. So they've told us they are really looking for help, as we'll hear today from the ambassador. You know, they don't want to do piecemeal projects anymore. they want this integrated approach, which the ambassador just described to us, to safeguard their security. And they really need support from donor countries like the United States and Germany and others to really help with the concessional financing and provide the technical support that is so badly needed. Prime Minister Netanyahu last night said that the multilateral system has fallen short. It hasn't been up to the task, and we'll hear more about that. I'm hoping Christina can kind of help elaborate on that a little bit. And they're really calling for this multi-dimensional vulnerability index and approach. And I want to just do a shameless shout out that we have already developed that here at the Stimson Center in our Corby project, and we're happy to work with the UN and island states and the US to do more with that. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to our expert panelists to really hear what's going on. And I'll start with you, Ambassador. Thank you again for coming. You're in town for the US Pacific Island Forum. You were at the State Department last night. You were at the White House yesterday. Can you describe to us really why Tuvalu is one of the most vulnerable countries, why you've come all the way to the United States to talk about climate issues, and a little bit about whether you think some of the announcements that have been coming out and the work that's going on is going to be helpful?
Thank you very much, Moderator Sally, for your kind word of introduction, and Talofa, and a very good morning to you all. I would like to recognize the ambassador of Germany here in Washington, D.C., as well as the, I don't know if I had it correctly, Secretary of State Morgan, and all of our valued participants who are here. I know that there are some that coming online virtually to listen to this very important event. Let me also at the outset thank Moderator Seri for for setting the scene about what is climate change and the effect of climate change that we all fully aware of, and especially have different views of the impacts that we face day in and day out. Our topic of discussion today is very relevant and very important to us, especially coastal communities, and especially us living in the islands. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Stimson for the invitation to be part of this important event. I am very grateful that it is an opportunity where I can speak the voices of the people of Tuvalu, and perhaps also represent the voice of the Pacific Island countries. Last week, we had a high-level week where in New York, at the margin of the UNGA, or the United Nations General Assembly 78th session. And during that week, there have been a lot of events running simultaneously, and some of the specific events that were organized through the UN process, one of which is the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit. A summit that was so encouraging, so impactful, the discussion that leaders made during the event. But beside that UN, there were other events, but also partly organized by the UN. And for Tuvalu, we are so grateful for the support of the UN through the Global Climate Mobility Center in helping us organize some of the side events. And these were the side events that were well attended, and the discussion that transpired were so encouraging. And two of those events is the Rising Nation Initiative, an initiative that was co-host or was launched last year and is led by Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and Kiribati. And this is an initiative that tries to bring to the international community the effect of climate change to low-lying atolls. And the event last week, the Rising Nation Initiative event, was extended to another initiative to take into account coastal communities which geographically or physically are not island in themselves. But these are also communities that are obviously affected by the impact of the rising sea. And so we initiated what we call now the CSET in short form, and that is the Coalition of Sea Level Rise and Existential Threat initiative. And I am so heartening by the support and the great support demonstrated by the government of Germany. The German Chancellor, in one of the lunch co-hosted by the AOCs and the Chancellor, he made mention of the importance of this coalition. And for us, Tuvalu, we are so grateful, and our Prime Minister himself acknowledged that when we host the event, the RNI event and the CSET event. And both of these events were attended by the President of the General Assembly of the UN, and even John Kerry, and many other presidents from around the globe, President of Latvia, the Prime Minister of Malta. And these clearly demonstrate the solidarity of like-minded states on the importance of addressing the impact of climate change and particularly the sea level rise. So that's basically the many meetings that took place in New York last week. And our coming to respond to your question of us coming down to Washington, D.C. This is a meeting, the second U.S. President and Pacific Island Leaders Summit. The first one was last year, and this is the second one. Yesterday we had lunch. I was part of our Prime Minister's delegation to the White House. Not the dinner though, okay. But to the White House where the leaders of the Pacific and all of us from the Pacific were so grateful of the opportunity to listen to the most powerful leaders, so to speak, when he announced a number of supports, financial supports and technical support of the United States to the joint efforts of addressing climate change, and particularly those that will be channeled for the Pacific region. I will leave that to Christine and Alice to elaborate on that. But for us in the Pacific, I was so touched by the leadership of the United States, and our leaders have acknowledged that. And last night, our Prime Minister was given the opportunity among the leaders to represent the leaders to say a few words for the occasion. And yes, he made a very powerful statement that we are at a climate war. What he meant by saying that is because of the very different perspective of member states and communities and people in addressing climate change, it appears that the multilateralism is not really up to bar to address the climate crisis. And so we feel that it is about time that major countries like the United States to demonstrate leadership in addressing the issue of climate change. But yes, we are so grateful for the support of major countries big countries like the US and Germany in helping small island countries. And the pledges that you also made mention this morning, which very encouraging for us. Madam Madrid, I will stop there and wait for your further direction. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much. I mean, you have really sort of, the fact that you're here with us today after your all day yesterday and like 2 weeks for the UNGA, I really commend you and I appreciate it. And you've really set the stage, and also, you know, the CSET initiative, the Rising Seas with Germany. I mean, you are leading in so many places, you know, not just for your own country, but for the other Pacific islands and island states around the world. But I'm going to turn it over to Christina because this is a good sort of way to sort of, you were also up at the UNGA in Climate Week, and I'm sure very involved with the activities in the lead up to the White House meeting and the dinner last night. So, you know, the U.S. government has just been tremendous. I mean, they've made major investments in climate resilience at home through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. But maybe you can help us understand sort of what was announced yesterday by President Biden and what are some of the other initiatives that the Biden administration is really doing to support climate resilience abroad and for the most vulnerable countries like the island states in the Pacific and elsewhere. And, you know, maybe you can help us sort of understand why these countries are saying they aren't feeling like they're breaking through and being heard where they need to be heard. So that's kind of a three-part question. Take whatever you'd like.
Thank you so much, Sally, and thank you to the German government and the ambassador, as well as Stimson Center, for organizing this event. It's really an honor to be at your inaugural event that is launching your climate talks, and really appreciate the powerful words from the ambassador from Tuvalu. So as you said, in terms of our president's commitment in supporting adaptation and resilience in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, he announced 2 years ago, actually 2 ungas ago, his effort to help support adaptation and resilience in developing countries, PREPARE. And when he launched PREPARE 2 years ago, he launched it combined with a commitment to work with Congress to provide $3 billion a year for international adaptation in developing countries by 2024. Now, the objective, the goal of PREPARE is to help more than 500 million people adapt to and manage the impacts of climate change. And I would say that you know, we have 3 priority areas within PREPARE that we've been working on that I think are quite relevant to what you said, Sally, and what the ambassador from Tuvalu said as well. The first is on early warning systems and climate information. That's absolutely critical. I know that our colleagues from NASA, for example, this year were in Tuvalu working with your government to help with better climate information, both with respect to the near term, but also longer term, including with sea level rise, as part of the Rising Nations Initiative. And that climate information and early warning systems is absolutely pivotal and foundational for anything we do to adapt and be resilient to the impacts of climate change. So that's priority area 1. And we are, several of the events in New York last week were related to, for example, the Secretary General's Early Warning for All initiative. And we're quite supportive of working with partners through that initiative to close the gap when it comes to early warning systems. The second area is making sure that we are integrating adaptation and climate resilience into all of the key systems that impact human well-being. The priority ones that we set out in the first action plan for PREPARE are food security, water, health, and infrastructure, with a focus especially on locally led adaptation and making sure that in terms of not just the money flowing to local level, but empowerment and ensuring that people have a seat at the decision-making table in terms of identifying what their priorities and needs are. Gender is also a cross-cutting area, as well as the issue, Ambassador, that you raised with respect to climate and mobility. I had the pleasure in New York last week to attend one of the events at the Climate and Mobility Center, and our undersecretary from the State Department was speaking about our efforts when it comes to integrating climate and migration, or human mobility. And that is also a really important aspect of Prepare, and how we're supporting countries that are particularly vulnerable deal with the impacts of climate change. The last area is on finance, and one piece of that is our support to the major multilateral funds like the GCF, but also the Adaptation Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund. And another piece of that third pillar is private sector. How do we mobilize the private sector, both in terms of capital, but also in terms of innovation and technologies? One of the programs that we're supporting through Prepare, for example, was testing and piloting some innovative technology using solar panels to create clean drinking water in the Pacific Islands, and seeing if we could do that in a way that is financially sustainable as well in the Pacific, and then scaling that out. So those would be the three priority areas with respect to Prepare. The announcements that we've made, and I'll speak to announcements we made yesterday, but also we made a few for the Pacific earlier this year as well. Secretary Blinken was in the PNG in May, and he announced our support for the Pacific Resilience Facility, really trying to support Pacific-led resilience, really quite important to us. And then yesterday announced doubling down on our support for early warning systems in the Pacific, as well as supporting the local 2030 network and peer-to-peer learning between islands and coastal communities. President Biden also announced yesterday that the United States considers the sea level rise induced by climate change does not impact any country's statehood or membership into the membership of the United Nations or other international organizations. And his commitment and our commitment to be working with, for example, Pacific Islands to make sure we meet those objectives. So those would be a few of the ways in which the administration is seeking to support developing countries that are particularly vulnerable, including coastal ones.
That's terrific, and I know as we move forward to COP, there will probably be more rolling out, but, I think there's no doubt of the commitment that the U.S., the State Department, has really shown for the Pacific Islands. The forum, it was the second one, and really was, has just showcased so much support. And, I have to say that the finance issue is such a big issue, and I want to get back to that in a minute. But before I do that, I want to ask Alice a couple questions that really pull in. Alice was sort of at the forefront of security at the National Security Council on climate, and as I mentioned earlier, created the first sort of government-wide, adaptation plan. And we're hearing what the State Department's done, and we heard how the ambassador talked about this integrated approach, and we know the U.S. with NOAA and so many of our own agencies, they're all really taking more of an integrated approach. But I guess, the question is, since Alice has been at the forefront of all of this, how easy is that? Why is it so important? And how do we get decision makers around the world to look at these issues in this integrated approach? Versus getting out of your silos. But why is it so important?
Well, thank you, Sally, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the German Embassy, the Stinson Center, Sally and Christina, it's kind of like old home week for us. We worked together in the Obama administration. And Ambassador, I want to thank you for your compelling remarks about the great need for action on climate. Why is action on climate so hard? That's probably the question that I find hardest to answer. I literally was asked in 2009. I'd previously been a judge, and if you look at this liability question, if we had a court in the world that could establish liability, there would be a lot of liability for the developed nations because they are primarily responsible for the heating that's currently occurring. But we don't have that. And so I was a judge who joined the Department of Homeland Security, this huge, sprawling security agency born out of 9/11. And right at the time I joined, President Obama issued an executive order requiring all federal agencies to plan for climate change, including adaptation. Now, climate change was not viewed as a career enhancer in 2009. And given the toxic political environment, it may not be in some places still, but it certainly wasn't then. And I didn't bring any expertise. I'd been a judge in Los Angeles, California, on the state court about climate change. But I was the new person. So, give it to her. She's new, was essentially what I heard. And that's how I ended up working on climate change, where I had the opportunity to work with the fantastic scientists at NASA and NOAA who gave me the opportunity to have what I call the aha moment. And that's the moment that one realizes climate change affects everything. Every system we have, every assumption we have about how the planet operates, and we need to adjust. Unfortunately, I reflected pretty much the demographic that's in charge. Virtually no training in climate change. So I think that's number one. Our leaders understand the energy security issues, which have come to the forefront with the Ukraine. But we haven't done so well on the cost-benefit analysis of what do these permanent changes to our ecosystems mean in terms of human security, migration, the ability of communities to thrive and survive. We just don't have that, and our modeling has not been sound in this area. I think the economic modeling has not been as sound as identifying the cost of the transition and the cost on fossil fuels. So that's one of the reasons I believe it's been hard, a lack of education and a lack of information about the cost and a lack of understanding that these are, in many cases, permanent changes that we can't undo. We can't refreeze Antarctica and the Arctic. That's not going to happen. The other thing, and this is a challenge for all of us as we approach our policy work, is simply human cognition. I've had the opportunity to look at all of these risks, but it's very difficult for the human brain to handle a risk the size of climate change. It was Lucretius, the Roman philosopher 2,000 years ago, who said basically humans are really bad at planning and preparing because they just essentially can't imagine what's ahead. And then fast forward, we have Daniel Kahneman, a social scientist, economist, saying, getting the Nobel Prize, saying, our cognitive biases prevent us from accurately assessing this. And the biggest in this play here is availability bias. So we all read about these events that are occurring now. And we read that 2023 is the hottest year we've ever had. And then we read all the people quoted. Oh, you know, I've never experienced flooding like this in Germany or in Syria or wherever you want to go. But with climate change, the kids born this summer, this was likely the coolest summer, among the coolest summers they'll ever have. And that is a fundamental change in how we understand risk. And we are having great difficulty, and this includes in our adaptation work, the UN has flagged this, that these events are overtaking our rather modest adaptation efforts so far, because we're simply not able to imagine how big it gets. Of course, to keep it from getting to its very worst, we need to cut emissions, and then we run into other reasons. And I think it was H.L. Mencken, I'm sure others have made this observation, but one of our journalists here from over 100 years ago who observed it's hard to convince somebody of the wisdom of something if their livelihood depends on it. And we have a lot of investments in the energy systems that exist today, and a lot of people who will suffer financially as we change. There'll be winners and losers, and that's always, perhaps that gets to the war comment, that always causes conflict. So there are a number of factors. All of this is not to say we shouldn't continue with the absolute urgency required. If anything, we are in the privileged position of knowing what's ahead, understanding what's ahead, and I feel all of us have a responsibility to help others understand that, get to their aha moment, and figure out how they can help to have a better future. And that means initiatives coming out of the Biden administration, which is the most climate-oriented administration we've ever had. It means the UN, our UN Secretary General, has continued his really unflagging efforts to bring attention to this. And then these events themselves, just to make sure that we are continuing to say, time's running out. And if you don't believe that, just look at the International Energy Agency's report issued this morning. We've got to cut our emissions by 25% by 2030. So that kid that's born this summer, they'll be entering first grade by the time we've cut our emissions by 25%. A very tall order to keep ourselves safe, but one we should be aiming for.
Well, Alice, thank you. I mean, I think you, in one of your books or reports, adapt or die, and I think that, I think that's true. I mean, we're all facing it. We see it. And so, Mr. Ambassador, I mean, Alice just put out both a grim and a hopeful message. No, I mean, we all are hopeful, really. And I think, my question for you really is, as she noted winners and losers, she was referring to the energy sector. But, I mean, your country has losers right now. It's not something in the future. And your economy, fisheries, tourism, many of those issues. Do you want to make a comment on that for those who are in the energy sector or are focusing on mitigation about what you're facing today? I mean, again, mitigation is absolutely critical. There's no doubt about it. But we need to help adapt and build resilience today as well. Do you have any thoughts on that you'd want to share with us, if you would, please?
Thank you very much, Sari. It goes without saying that there are two mainstream of climate change that we are trying to address. Obviously, mitigation, where we want our big emitters to take on the responsibility to cut down on that, to move and transition from fossil fuel, for example, to green and renewable energy sources. Before I go to the adaptation side of climate change, let me say that us in the Pacific and in Tuvalu, for instance, we are the least responsible, but the most at risk. And I cannot overemphasize that. The recent report of the IPCC with regards to the contributions of small island countries who are labeled as least responsible, for Tuvalu, it's 0.00004% of the greenhouse gas emission. And we are at the forefront of the risk of that. Because of the very concern that we have about the slow efforts of major economies who rely very much on non-renewable energy sources. We went out of what we used to say out of the box and look at initiatives that can further solicit the support of like-minded countries. This year, even at the UN last week, we, for the first time, launched the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And we are co-leading that, Tuvalu and Vanuatu. These are the efforts we went out of the box to, to advocate and bring to the attention of major economies or major emitters, so to speak, about the plight that we are already facing. And I'm very glad to say that there are few major countries who also have high percentage of their energy comes from fossil fuel, already attended and so demonstrate support, like Colombia, Ireland, about the initiative, and there is so strong support of taking this through. And I guess this is what we need to continue to advocate and talk to big emitters on. We, of course, understand the impact of that to the economies. We respect that, but we are at the same time look at what someone mentioned that either we want to have a prosperous economy through fossil fuel or through non-renewable energy. What he was trying to mention here is that if we want to keep with the status quo, then obviously we will continue to have good life, but not as long. Maybe in the next 100 years, then big economies will come to face what we are facing now. So that's the part that small island countries like Tuvalu have embarked on, try to bring to the international community the importance of working on cutting down on mitigation on greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of the adaptation, for us, that is something that we really want to see from big countries. For Tuvalu, day in, day out, we are facing the real impact of climate change. In any high tides, we experience the inundation of water intruding through our waterlands, causing the increasing salinity in the water and causing vegetation to die, not producing what we used to know in the past years. And this is our livelihoods. And droughts, we are starting to experience the frequency of droughts, and not only the frequency, but it's becoming longer. And that's really an issue that comes to the issue of water security and food security that you alluded to earlier on. And we need to adapt to all this. And we need support from our development partners, the international community. But let me say, the most important adaptation that we, from Tuvalu, being a low-lying atoll nearly 2 meters above sea level, is to reclaim land and elevate. We already have a major plan funded by the World Bank to develop, but we are still looking for financial support. And this is what we call the long-term adaptation plan, the LTAP. And this is to reclaim land into the lagoon. The geographical formation or topographical formation of the capital island is a big underground volcano, a dead volcano, I think.
We hope.
Hopefully, yeah.
And so we are looking at reclaiming that into the lagoon and raise it to about 2 meters above the existing level. For us, and according to scientific information that we receive from technical people, that can sustain life in Tuvalu for into the next century and beyond. So for us, whatever adaptation projects that we are looking at, strengthening our resilience through proper infrastructure and all this, that won't work because the sea is still coming up. Unless we focus first in getting this reclamation land and elevate it and build all the resilient infrastructure, we won't be able to. I mean, it's a waste of having the current level of where we live to strengthen our infrastructure, because obviously the tide or the sea is still rising. So for us, we really want to see developed countries and financial institutions to help us with our LTAP project, because only through that we can survive. And that is what we in Tuvalu, and especially myself, always looking at this phrase, which is now becoming a very important phrase, like existential threat. It is defined by by Prostrom, that existential threat is a threat to the livelihood or the mere existence of humanity. That is obviously important for all of us. But for Tuvalu, it is imminent. The rising sea, if we cannot do this LTAP project, will be extinguished, should I say, or eradicated from the surface of the earth. And that is purely what is existential threat. Others may look at it as existential threat in terms of the lack of food that will be provided to them. But to us, it is the existential threat to our state,
So
our home.
you just raised a really important point, and I'd like to ask Christina about it before we go to questions from the audience,
Yeah,
if that's
sure.
okay. So Christina, I mean, you've been at the State Department for a while. You work for Secretary or Spec Kerry, my old boss, who's been committed to these issues since he first came to public service. So you sit in those rooms where these issues are being debated, and mitigation and adaptation, and how do we get adaptation to rise up to be, I don't know about equal with mitigation, but certainly very important for those countries and island states that are facing what we just heard from the ambassador now?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Ambassador, when you were talking, I wasn't just thinking about adaptation, but I was thinking about the efforts this year that we have to fulfill our mandate from Sharm el-Sheikh on helping the most vulnerable respond to losses and damages related to climate change. So I think it is both the elevation of the way in which we deal with the impacts of climate change and help to build resilience, whether it be through anticipatory or ex-ante efforts, sort of before the losses and the damages happen, as well as ex-post. And the example you just raised with respect to Tuvalu and rising sea level, and combined with even earlier rising sea level and inundation and impacts on freshwater resources, right? That my understanding will impact Tuvalu well before the sea level rises above the land. I mean, those existential threats are related to slow onset, and of course, the relationship between slow onset and extreme events like storms as well. To me, we need to be so laser focused on ensuring that the support is there to manage those slow onset events. I've been working on the transitional committee that was tasked from Sharm el-Sheikh to establish these new funding arrangements on loss and damage. And one of the proposals we put forward earlier in the year at the start of the transitional committee was to ensure that this new fund that will hopefully be operationalized in Dubai is focused on slow onset events. The recognition, actually from talking to one of the champions on loss and damage from Tuvalu in Sharm el-Sheikh, because he raised this issue of land reclamation and sea level rise. This is a gap in the sort of global architecture of how we support responses to the impacts of climate change. So our hope is that when this fund is operationalized in Dubai, it does include a specific focus on slow onset events, that the fund is designed in a way that countries like yours can go to it with your plans, and it sounds like you've already got a long-term plan whereby we have more effective access and learning from lessons of the past in terms of how we set up a fund so that access is more streamlined and easier for, especially for countries like yours, where you are determining what your programmatic approaches are in dealing with slow onset events, and you're identifying who your implementers are. And that's sort of what we envisage when it comes to this loss and damage fund. At the same time, I am personally working on adaptation for the last 20 years, want to make sure that we're still also focused on mitigation and keeping 1.5 degrees alive, as well as making sure we're focused on adaptation. So Dubai is also a big year on adaptation as well, with the global goal on adaptation and the establishment of a framework. And we really hope that that framework is going to help drive both action as well as support to adaptation in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable. We have the commitment from Glasgow for doubling of adaptation finance. We're waiting for the release of the report from the Standing Committee on Finance on how we're doing on that doubling of adaptation finance, combined with the OECD report on adaptation finance as well. I think we'll have a better understanding in a few months of how we're doing and what is still needed to scale up finance on adaptation. So I think there's like 3 things we need to be doing and doing at once and at an accelerated pace.
Wow, that's great to hear. I mean, thank you for that. I mean, I have to say from our own experience here at the Stimson Center, you know, the State Department is supporting our work in Madagascar, which is this multi-pronged approach. And specifically, it is empowering the people of Madagascar to identify what they need for adaptation across all those different sectors. Now, I know we're running a little late, but we're going to take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if we could, if there are any. So, yes, we have one over here, and Lilia will bring you a microphone.
Hi, I'm Sarah Schoenhart. I'm a reporter with E&E News. I have a question. Christina, you mentioned loss and damage, and there was a ministerial last week in New York as part of the United Nations talks. There still seem to be quite large divisions on sort of who should be eligible to receive money from a loss and damage fund. I think the U.S. prefers particularly vulnerable countries like least developed countries and small island states. Others disagree. I'm curious where you see a landing coming on who could receive funds, and then is the U.S. prepared to contribute money to a fund once it's operationalized?
Do you want to take them all? Okay. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for those questions. In terms of the ministerial and this issue of eligibility, so we put out a bridging proposal a few weeks ago, right ahead of the 3rd meeting of the Transitional Committee, which took place in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. And in that bridging proposal for the eligibility piece of the fund, we thought that it made most sense to use the language from the Sharm el-Sheikh decision, which is that developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change should be eligible to the fund. I think you're referring to the EU submission that was just made with respect to a focus on LDCs and SIDS. So for our proposal that we put out a few weeks ago, we thought we would use the Sharm el-Sheikh language. What we have said, however, is with respect to allocation, the board does need, the eventual board of this fund will need to come up with an allocation model for how to allocate resources. And so In our proposal, we have tasked the board to develop a system for allocation based on vulnerability. I say that because while in terms of who is eligible, it would be particularly vulnerable countries, developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, which is the SHARM language. We don't think that the fund should be based on a first-come, first-served basis. So there needs to be an allocation model. We do need to be thinking about how we allocate across countries, and therefore we think it's up to the board to develop that system for allocation. That was, did you have a second question?
About finance and whether the U.S. is prepared.
So we're not at that stage yet. We'd like to see, we are very, very hopeful that at the end of the fourth and final meeting, which takes place in mid-October in Egypt, that we come to a completion of our task as the transitional committee, and we put forward a completed recommendation to the parties in Dubai. And that's where our attention and focus is at. That's our hope. And if we can get there, then I think we can begin thinking about what might happen and what would be a useful next step with respect to Dubai, including with respect to the startup pledges.
So if I could build on the question that Sarah just asked about vulnerability, Alice, I mean, vulnerability, comes in all shapes and sizes. When we, in the vulnerability index that we have developed, looks at social, economic, environmental, and political issues and really integrates them. And so I don't know the definition of vulnerability in this context, but can you sort of explain to us why it's so important to look at not just one vulnerability, not like just the vulnerability of sea level rise or the vulnerability to the environment, but how they all sort of work together from your experience and research?
Yes, it has been a challenge because you'll see the tendency is to want to, with climate change, to look at vulnerability in peril by peril. And understand not all perils befall all communities. But it's really how perils intersect with one another that cause communities to suffer the greatest damage. And so examples of that are you can have extreme heat followed by flooding, which affects your public health system, which once your public health system goes, you have huge damage to the ability of schools to operate and other things. It just, these threats cascade through economies and through people's lives. So in all the groups I've worked in, there's this tension because it's easier to just say, I want to look at one peril. It's easier to plan for one peril. But if you do that, I think you're opening up yourself up to greater vulnerability that you haven't thought, what if something else happens? And all these perils, by the way, are not climate change. They could be a volcano. They could be an earthquake. And then you could have an event occurring. And that's, looking at the United States, that's one of the challenges that our emergency management community is suffering. We're seeing compounding disasters where multiple events occur in clusters or right after one another. Much harder to plan for. It requires a whole of society. And the one thing we've heard is you have to have trust in the community. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of meetings. But I will tell you one place that has done a better job here in the United States is Louisiana. Louisiana, after the Gulf oil spill, received substantial funding, over $50 million to start planning for some of the challenges that they face, including subsidence, sinking of the land, which is causing saltwater intrusion as saltwater goes up further into coastal areas, as well as heat, as well as more intense storms. And Louisiana met not all their parishes, but in many, a group of parishes, and came up with a plan to start talking about these things and achieve something that we have not achieved elsewhere in the United States, talking about which areas we could protect and which areas we're not going to be able to protect. But that takes massive planning to do that. So I think it's very difficult, but in the long run, we shouldn't be too attracted by just one peril, because climate change enters all our systems, and it will be a drag if we just count on one event occurring. High likelihood other events will follow.
Thank you. And I think, as you said, we've even seen that in the United States with the hurricane that hit Florida. Who were the most at risk? The elderly, the poor, the disabled, even us. We're going to close, but I see one last question. If we can be quick, and then I'm going to wrap it up because I know we have other meetings to move on to.
Thank you very much. It's been interesting. My name is David O'Neill from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And my question is on the mobilization of private finance for adaptation and this juxtaposition between public and private finance. Many of those countries most impacted by the climate crisis are, of course, also impacted by the debt crisis, and how it can be ensured that private finance doesn't further exacerbate this debt crisis, particularly around adaptation, where it's more sort of complicated to get to receive a return on investment for private finance. Thank you.
So we are going to be having another event soon about financing within this series, but do any of you want to take that on quickly before we close?
Sure. I think you raise an excellent point. The finance challenge for adaptation is high because what is the rate of return for a private investor? Sometimes it's really hard to identify that. Not as hard for mitigation. It's also harder to, we don't have a good metric for resilience. We can measure how much carbon we've averted or greenhouse gases we've averted from the atmosphere or how much we're taking out. We don't have a similar metric that measures how resilient a community is after that investment. So it makes it less attractive as well. And then you've talked about this debt. And the countries that are often in the most need are saddled with debt, and that their debt payment towards debt service means that they're not giving payment to schooling or other really fundamental social services. But I think we are seeing some exciting developments. During the pandemic, there was just the beginning of rumblings of let's have a hurricane clause. So what that would mean is, and it's Barbara Motley from Barbados who's championed this, but that was just kind of being talked about, that we will, if a hurricane hits, then there should be a pause in repayment of debt because we want that country to be able to provide the social services to keep their populations safe and secure and not mean that a lot of kids miss out on school and there's no public help. And that has become mainstream. So I think there's a far greater understanding. We've also heard more about debt jubilees, that we're going to have to really forgive some of this debt. And in the ecosystem of a Washington and the think tanks, far more attention to what are these multinationals going to do. The World Bank, of course, with a new leader expressing interest. And then we're seeing in private philanthropy, the Rockefeller Foundation basically reversed course this month and said, we're all about climate change. That's all we're going to spend our money on. So we are seeing far greater interest. Is it enough? No. And will it happen quickly enough? Not for everywhere. But it is very hopeful that the machinery of international finance will alter. I don't have the answer for private investment in adaptation. It's been a challenge ever since the beginning.
Thank you. And so, again, we're going to have more on this topic at an upcoming event, and we really are going to dig into the Bridgetown Agreement that Alice talked about from Barbados, as well as really that gap, the gap from when you do your plan to when you need those bankable projects. Some call it, the valley of death. But we need to get confidence for the financiers that they feel confident that the information in their work is going to be meaningful moving forward. So I just want to thank our panel. I mean, this has been just a tremendous panel. All solution approach that I think we heard Alice talk about, just this, multinational pledge trust. And we're going to keep covering those issues in our series, and thank you to the German embassy here for being so supportive as we talk about gender and finance and peacekeeping. Christina, thank you for all the work you do every day and for taking time to be with us. I mean, Christina is the heart of the administration on global adaptation, and so we're really grateful for your work and your knowledge. And Mr. Ambassador, you know, you live it every day. You are in front of, you know, a group of people that are sensitive to what the plight of your country is. And you're at the United Nations, you're here in Washington, really representing those interests. And keep up the good work, because it's telling the story that really helps all of us move forward on this. So with that, I'm just going to thank all of you for joining and look forward to you at other events coming forward. And have a great, great week. Thank you.